Chapter 26. 1994. He had come to his office early that afternoon to mark papers submitted there. Previous year. Much of 1993 had been disrupted by strikes and campus closures, and he hoped against all odds that the new year would be different. He had asked his students to consider the Indian National Congress in the 1940s. Its spokesmen were Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah, and their respective views regarding religious tensions in India at the time. He saw many parallels between the Indian and Nigerian experience, and hoped his students would find their same, extrapolate and discuss, but the papers were disappointing. At best, students summarized text and, at worst, like the one he now read, they plagiarized. It frustrated him to find undergraduates writing in this way, but he understood WHV. Students could not be expected to study when the physical conditions in which they lived were so appalling. Rooms, designed to house two, now took 6 or more, and the library, once well stocked and up to date, resembled a museum with a handful of torn and dusty exhibits. And this was why he felt so compelled to write more and more against the injustices that he saw all around him. His family thought him reckless, and Bissy sent him several angry letters, warning that his outspoken views could endanger not only himself but others. He felt tempted to write back and tell her to save her anger for her drunken husband, a much greater menace to family than he could ever be, but he knew Bissy wouldn't listen to him. She never did. He knew things were dangerous. She didn't need to tell him this, and he was careful. A new decree gave soldiers the right to detain suspects without charge, and he had no intention of disappearing without seeing his Khmer again. Teo straightened the remaining stack of papers and stood up to stretch. He glanced at his watch. It was late and his head hurt. Time to go home. Not that there was anyone waiting for him there. These days, even his brothers and sisters had stopped asking him to take care of their children, and Hawa was away visiting relatives in Abuja. Though he missed Hawa's company, he did not miss her demands. She was bright but immature and petulant at times. He had begun to wish that she would find someone else, someone she could marry, which seemed to be the thing foremost on her mind. Teo ran his hands over the faded pictures that hung above his desk. Here was an old postcard he had brought back from Oxford with the colours of the aureole now looking brown, rather than the original bright white and yellow. He had read somewhere that the aureole made its last voyage around West Africa in 1974, which also marked the time when Teo saw the hopes of African nationalism begin to fizzle. Perhaps the ship's departure was a sign of times to come, which would make an interesting story for his students, and more gripping perhaps than the Indian National Congress. One could start with the making of the ship and the British company that built it. For what purposes were these ships constructed, and what of the slave ships that preceded them? The aureole was now laid up in Eleusis Bay, waiting to be broken up for scrap metal. Soon it would be gone, and another marker of West Africa's history would be buried along with all the stories and desires engendered by the ship. Teo imagined that few would remember the way white colonial officers once looked so condescendingly at other white travelers, and how they in turn glared back in contempt at those pretending to be the African Raj. Few would remember the shock of Africans watching Europeans getting drunk at sunrise, and the even greater shock of finding some of their own providing cheap entertainment at ports, diving like dogs playing fetch it for coins tossed into the water by the Europeans. Perhaps it was better that some of these memories be buried. Nobody knew where the ship would be taken for its final and ignoble death, but the guess was the ship-breaking shores of Alang, which brought their story back to India. Teo sighed as he put down the postcard and looked at all the other pictures pinned to the wall. The rest were Kemi creations hanging loosely on dry bits of sellotape. "My child, my dear child," he murmured to himself. "You are grown up now. What are you doing on this Friday night? Are you with your mother or have you gone out with friends? Look after your mother, my child. See that she is happy until I come." He sighed again, wishing that he could talk with his daughter, but they hardly spoke these days, not in letters, not even on the phone. Miriam told him that Kemi felt abandoned, but he never knew whether she was projecting her own feelings, or whether this was really how Kemi felt. Sometimes he thought of writing to his daughter, to reassure her and explain that he was not abandoning her, but how could he write of these things when Kemi had not mentioned them herself? Teo shut his door and locked it. 5 years had passed since Miriam and Kemi left, and 2 years since he had seen them last. "Too long," he muttered, walking down the corridor and then outside where he caught the last glimmer of iridescent light. Only in Joe's had he known such shimmering light after the rains, which cheered him slightly as he nodded absently to the night watchman. "Professor." The guard jumped from his seat to salute. "Good night," Teo replied, shivering a little. The temperature had suddenly dropped. When he started the car he noticed that the petrol gauge was low, a reminder to queue for petrol tomorrow. He would wake up early, at some ungodly hour, 4 or 5 in the morning, to drive to Dogundut's mobile station where he heard there was fuel. How crazy that a country exporting millions of gallons. Teo shook his head. It throbbed now, and his arms felt like lead weights. He rested his head for on the steering wheel, but it didn't help. The same searing pain. Further down the road he saw a roadblock, one of many popping up all over the place these days. Sometimes the soldiers would just peer into the car and wave you on, but usually they wanted money and would delay. A driver with questions, holding out for the biggest possible dash, recalled a time when this sort of thing never happened, when bribes were not the norm, and professors were treated with respect. "Good evening," Teo said, winding down his window. "Good evening, sir," replied the soldier, wielding a rifle. "Where you'da horn? Make I see driver license," the soldier barked. Teo took it from the glove compartment and handed it to the man, who looked at it and then walked off. Another soldier returned with the license. "Professor, we go take you for questioning. Now. "For what?" "Yon no fit here?" "For questioning." The soldier pointed his rifle into the half-open window. Teo hesitated. "Get out," the soldier shouted, gesturing with his gun for Teo to step out of the car. El refused to get out of this vehicle without being told why. "Come out," the soldier shouted, forcibly pulling Teo from his seat. Teo looked quickly around to see if he knew anyone in the cars behind him, but there was no one, so he surrendered his keys, as ordered, and got into the back seat where he was sandwiched between 2 soldiers, one of whom clamped a hand around the back of his neck and forcibly thrust his head down. As they sped away, Teo prayed for the first time in years. The soldier had loosened his grip so he could breathe, but he dared not raise his face. He tried to guess where they were taking him from the turns they took and the condition of the road, but he quickly became disorientated and began to think of how long it would be before people noticed he was missing. The house boy would not raise the alarm, and nor would his family, who were used to him being away. Perhaps someone at the university might notice his absence. But then there was so much chaos, though he doubted it. He began to think that he should have thought of something earlier. His reactions had not been quick enough. Would Hoa worry if she did not hear from him? His only hope was that someone had seen him arrested. Fellow writers would notice within a day or two that he was quiet, but a day or two might be too long. The car stopped suddenly and the soldier holding his neck let go, allowing him to sit up and get out. It was dark outside and ominously quiet. Teo made out several rectangular buildings that looked like school buildings or dormitories. Army barracks. One had lights on, and that seemed to be where they were taking him. He thought of making a dash for it, but to where? A foolish idea. They led him in, releasing his arms as they marched him to a room where an other soldier sat behind a desk. The men saluted and left. Sit, the officer ordered as he grinned a gap-toothed smile. There was nowhere to sit. Sit, the man bellowed. So Teo knelt on the ground, crossing his legs to hide his trembling. Yes, that's right, the officer laughed. I'm the professor now. Sit on there. Floor like we used to at nursery school. Remember those days? Teo snapped. Let me remind you, Professor, that here you have no power, and one would advise you to watch that tongue of yours. You hear? You hear? He banged both fists on the desk. You have KPCCN warned to stop your incendiary activities, and yet you have. Teo asked, anger making him brave. What incendiary activities? Not. Are you trying to mock me? No, Teo answered quickly, watching as the soldier thumped a pistol onto. Good. Much better. I think you know very well about the articles you are the table publishing and those lectures you are giving. Who is giving you the right to be disrespectful? It's not a question of respect, it's a question of a question of what? The soldier shouted. He stood up and walked towards Teo, his boots stopping just inches from Teo's knees. A question of what? He sneered. It's a question of wanting the best for our country, Teo replied as calmly as he could. You think we don't know best? I'll think. No, you don't think, the soldier interrupted, walking back to his desk to retrieve his pistol. Anything more to say? Teo shook his head. So I am going to call my men to remove you, but if we hear one more thing. He lifted the gun and pointed it at Teo, PA. He shouted, laughing as Teo jumped. Then came the beating. Please, please, please don't, Teo cried, covering his head. I beg you. Please. The soldier nearest him watched for a moment and then struck him suddenly with his pistol, sending him crashing to the floor, but not before his face banged against the table in front of him. He felt sharp, crushing pains in his side and back. He was being kicked repeatedly. HC tried screaming, but nothing carny. And as he looked up, something bright and strangely beautiful exploded in his head. When he opened his eyes, he was cowering in a corner and there was nobody else in the room. I won't write anymore, he whispered, cradling his knees until he heard some